Hello, my name is Dr. Rowena Christiansen, and today I will be talking to you about some of the challenges and conundrums regarding the issue of human reproduction in space. This topic is, I think, what you could call the elephant in the room, something that's going to have to be addressed for humanity to become a true spacefaring species, but something that not a lot of people want to talk about. And there's also the issue to be addressed that if we start having pregnancy and childbirth in space, whether, given the principles of evolution and natural selection, this may end up in a new race of humans. So today's topics are going to include space effect on human reproduction, looking at some specific issues for pregnancy and childbirth in space, looking at the implications of gravity, or more specifically, the lack thereof, thinking about medical care for women and children, the rights of the child in space and extreme environments, and finally, a light-hearted look at the idea that space tourism may become popular for conception in space, and then a few concluding remarks. There are a number of deleterious space effects on the human reproductive system, and this all needs to be placed in the overall context of age-related changes in fertility, especially for female astronauts, as female fertility declines significantly over the age of 35. And it's probably worthwhile to consider the use of reproductive technology for both genders. And in addition to the space effects, stress, circadian rhythm disruption and exercise can all affect the menstrual cycle and estrogen production. Some of the observed effects from spaceflight and microgravity in rodent studies include menstrual cycle changes or cessation, decreased successful pregnancy rates and decreased neonatal offspring survival, reduced ovarian function, reduced levels of testosterone, and decreased testicular weight and sperm production. And if that wasn't all bad enough, the effects of space radiation may include for women the destruction of ovarian egg-producing cells, depletion of the ovarian reserve, premature ovarian failure and increased ovarian tumours. For men, germ cell destruction and reduced sperm production and DNA damage to sperm. And in both genders, possible genetic mutations in offspring and sterility or infertility. And gravity is perhaps the biggest elephant in the room. And we also need to think about different gravitational environments and transitioning between different gravitational environments. So we have 1g on Earth, 1/6 of the Earth's gravity on the Moon, 1/3 on the Mars, and the larger the planet, the larger the gravity. And if we start to think about the whole process of reproduction and rearing of children in space, there are many intricate and complex phases of reproduction in mammals. And just to run through these sequentially, first of all, the process of mating, then you need fertilization, implantation, development of the placenta, development of the embryo, development of organs within the embryo, and then further prenatal and postnatal development, the process of birth and lactation and suckling. One really interesting finding in adult animals flown in space was that fertilization difficulties could potentially occur due to disruption of the hypothalamic neurochemistry important for the receptive components of copulation, especially the hormone oxytocin. And in rodent studies, oxytocin remained reduced at 18 weeks following spaceflight, and this effect might be more significant in women, as oral contraceptives, which are commonly taken by female astronauts, reduce circulating oxytocin levels. So given the influence of spaceflight and oral contraceptive use on oxytocin release, further research is necessary to determine whether this combination could have long-term effects on reproductive health. And oxytocin is also the feel-good chemical which contributes to bonding between mother and offspring, and thus it could be critical in postpartum behaviours. So there are a number of implications of long-duration spaceflight for the viability of immediate offspring in terms of being able to bond with the mother and the mother wanting to rear that offspring, as well as the subsequent generation of offspring. And the researchers raised the possibility that this could possibly be an everlasting effect within the families of those chosen to participate in such missions. And if we go on to think about the actual process of partying in space, then the physics aspect is somewhat tricky. If you think of the principle for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So elastic straps or Velcro or some other methods of attachment may be needed. And it's interesting to speculate whether the lack of gravity may also play a role in other reproductive processes. For instance, will sperm need to know which direction to travel in? So normally they travel up through the vagina, up through the uterus, out along the fallopian tubes, perpendicular to the forces of gravity. And potentially the lack of gravity may also play a role in other reproductive processes. Once the egg is fertilized, will it know which direction to travel in? So normally it travels up through the fallopian tubes against the force of gravity, then down through the fallopian tubes perpendicular to the force of gravity, then down in the uterus until it implants in the uterine wall. So will there be a higher risk of ectopic pregnancies if the fertilized egg is just hovering around in the fallopian tube, not knowing where to go? And another question is what happens with the normal physiological changes in pregnancy? Relatively few women have flown in space, and we don't know enough about female physiology in space, let alone the physiology of pregnant females in space. And there are significant changes in all the major body systems during pregnancies, including respiratory, cardiovascular, hepatic, and renal changes. And this is a great unknown whether any of these may actually become maladaptive in the space environment, given the existing physiological changes that we know about. And looking further at some of the rodent studies, fertilization of mouse eggs seems to proceed normally in simulated microgravity, but subsequent embryonic development is delayed or arrested. Rats mated during spaceflight showed early evidence of pregnancy loss. Limited mammalian data suggests that spaceflight and microgravity may adversely affect very early embryonic development, whereas development during the second half of gestation proceeds fairly normally. And if you have a look at the diagram on the right, the critical stages of human prenatal development also occur in the first half of pregnancy, and particularly up to the age of around 16 weeks of gestation. Given that a full-term pregnancy is 38 weeks, this would correspond pretty well with what's been seen in the rodent studies in space, and may particularly have implications for developmental abnormalities. It's also really interesting to note that animals flown from mid to late gestation required a lot more contractions during labour due to alterations in the abdominal musculature. And this was associated with two things. One was decreased uterine expression of connexin, which is important for synchronization and coordination of labour contractions, and also with atrophy of the transverse abdominal muscles. And these muscles are needed for postural control under gravity, but are not exercised during flight, but are involved in contractions during labour. The lack of gravity may also play a role in other reproductive processes. So normally with human babies, they rotate head first prior to birth, but will the baby know that it needs to do this in the absence of gravity? And could there be an increased risk of breech presentations where the baby presents bottom first, or with bottom and one or more legs sticking out? And as a result, could there be an increased incidence of positional birth complications and the need for intervention during delivery? Giving birth is a very dynamic process with lots of pushing, so the laws of physics could also be problematic here. It's a very messy business, and we have to think about what happens to blood in space. Venous blood adheres to local surface due to surface tension, but arterial blood will spurt out and form droplets, which can get in the way and contaminate the local area. And as mentioned earlier, pregnant rats who'd been in space needed twice as many contractions to deliver due to weakened abdominal muscles. Emergency caesarean surgery will be challenging, and the movie Prometheus, I guess, is an example of how messy surgery in space could be, even though there was an artificial gravity environment in that particular movie. And the use of inhaled anaesthetics such as nitrous oxide would be problematic in a closed environment, as it's very difficult to filter them out of the air, and it could affect the other people in the immediate vicinity. Now, there was a really interesting study, which I'm now going to mention, around the vestibular system. So on Earth, the inner ear vestibular system plays a key part in balance and spatial orientation. But in space, this system, which is very sensitive to gravity, no longer conveys feelings of rotation or up and down. And there's conflict between what the eyes see and the brain's perception of motion and orientation. And unborn rat fetuses developing to Earth demonstrated an extreme sensitivity to positional disturbance. And this probably reflects a difference in how the vestibular system develops in space, and the researcher commented that the nervous system just isn't used to the constant pull of gravity. And this could particularly be a problem in transitioning between gravitational environments for humans. Another issue we need to think about is medical care. So both obstetric care and paediatrics require specialised knowledge. And given that seats will be limited, do we take generalists or specialists or both? We also need to think about communications and evacuations. If we're in low Earth orbit or on the moon, the communications delay is not very significant. But if you're out at Mars or on the way to Mars, it could be up to 24 minutes each way, depending on distance. Evacuation is definitely possible from the ISS. It's probably also possible from the moon, depending how urgent the situation is, but it's completely unrealistic for Mars. So then we need to be able to turn to a couple of solutions. If we can't evacuate quickly, telemedicine is very useful for advice and instructions, but it is dependent on the availability of electricity and suitable technology, and also good space weather. So this should only be used as an adjunct to a largely autonomous expeditionary health service, whether this is on the ISS in space flight or with colonisation. And the further out you get, the more problematic timely access becomes. And in the absence of telemedicine, astronauts will need to rely on their own knowledge base, training, skills, good teamwork, and access to a large digital database of medical information. I'd now like to turn to talking about the rights of the child in space and extreme environments. So on Earth we have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which sets out a great many number of rights that all children should be entitled to. But if we're taking children out of their natural environment on the Earth, we're taking them into space, or we're taking them to another planetary body, then there's a real question around how many of the rights that we would actually be able to afford to children in these strange and extreme environments. And indeed, ethically speaking, is it right to be able to take children to these places when we can't properly look after them the same way that we would look after them on Earth? And one particular level to think about is radiation. And on Earth, the amount of cosmic radiation which reaches the surface is fairly low, and the total amount of radiation that we receive on an annual basis is fairly low. But this is significantly increased on Mars, you could say approximately 100 times. And also solar radiation, a lot of that is absorbed by the atmosphere on Earth, but there's negligible absorption on Mars. And radiation, particularly ionizing radiation, is a real problem for children because it particularly affects fast-growing cells. And relevant exposures include pre- and postnatal radiation for medical reasons, radon in the home, and accidental radiation releases. And in some cases, children may receive higher doses than adults because of higher intake and accumulation. Sensitivity to radiation is highest earlier in life, and although the mechanism of greater susceptibility is not well understood, it is likely to be linked to greater cell division in growing and developing tissues. And in addition, a longer expected lifetime with a resultant increased chance of repeated exposure and accumulated damage also leads to a higher cancer risk for children. Fetuses may be particularly sensitive to ionizing radiation, since their tissue cells are not only undergoing high rates of division, but are also differentiating into mature functional cells. And a number of radiation-associated cancers which are common in children include leukemia, breast cancer, thyroid cancer, and brain cancer. And another issue which I think we should really consider and try to work out the implications of is whether children are actually going to be able to grow and develop in a normal way in space, given what we know about the effects of spaceflight and microgravity on muscles and bones, and that in adults there's significant loss of bone and muscle strength very quickly as a result of spaceflight, and that a great deal of exercise is required to try to mitigate the effects of that. Children actually need to be able to grow and strengthen their muscles and bones as part of normal development. So there's a real issue as to whether this is actually going to be possible in a spaceflight environment. And another interesting issue that if a child does develop in a zero-gravity environment, it's probably going to have less need for thicker bones, the same as it would have on Earth, and stronger muscles as it would have on Earth. So what happens when that child transitions into a gravitational environment? Is that child actually going to be able to manage the additional gravitational load? If you think of the implications of the change in mass. So if you suddenly go from weighing nothing to weighing 70 kilos, that's a huge increase. And lastly, I would like to finish on a humorous note with the idea that's been postulated by some that space tourism may become popular in the idea of going to space to conceive your child. And there are a number of space station projects which have been postulated, a sort of luxury hotel to beat all luxury hotels. They will be expensive. This is one example that would be deployed at the same altitude approximately as the International Space Station, and would also complete one trip around the planet every 90 minutes, thus seeing a lot of aurorae. Bigelow Aerospace does have a bit of track record because it did attach a prototype to the ISS in 2016, and it plans to press on with that. Axiom Space is also proceeding with some plans to build a space station in space and also to take space tourists. The Gateway Foundation has a really interesting proposal to build a rotating space station similar to the concept in 2001, A Space Odyssey, which will have artificial gravity similar to the Moon at 1/6 of the Earth's gravity. So in conclusion, we've only begun to scratch the surface of the complex physiological and ethical issues associated with human reproduction in microgravity and on other celestial bodies. The many unknowns which exist will need to be addressed through animal experiments before we start experimenting with humans. And from the ethical perspective, before human reproduction in space becomes a reality, the subject will need to move from being the elephant in the room to being robustly discussed in keeping with the remainder of the space program. Thank you very much for your attention today. And just to finish with some artist's conception of bases on the Moon and Mars. And there are a couple of pages of references and image credits. Thank you very much.